It's the third major open-world game by Ubisoft in 2020, but can a new hero and new adventure win over the masses? Hello friends, it's Kodiak here, one half of the team behind Legacy Gaming, and today we're sharing everything you need to know before diving in to Immortals Fenyx Rising. Right when you thought Ubisoft was done making new open-world games, they surprised us all with Immortals Fenyx Rising, a brand new IP that looks to challenge Nintendo's title for family-friendly adventure games. While Immortals isn't Zelda, there's no doubt the game is inspired by the series, and that all starts with the world. Immortals takes place on the Golden Isles, a fictional place that taps into the more glamorous side of Greek mythology. Unlike Assassin's Creed Odyssey that blurs the line between fact and fiction, Immortals takes the best ideas from Greek mythos and amplifies them tenfold. At first glance, it's impossible to miss the game's distinct art style. Popularized by Breath of the Wild and adopted by games like Genshin Impact, this loosely falls into the cel-shaded category, and while we can argue all day the specific label, there's no doubt this is becoming a popular style, one we've seen in indie and AAA games alike. The Golden Isles are broken into a variety of regions, and most are influenced by a specific Greek god. Each of these areas has a distinct look and feel, and as I mentioned, because of the more fictional nature of the game, the developers are able to push their artistic ideas much further than ever before. The world itself is big, but doesn't rival the expansiveness of an Assassin's Creed game. While maybe not the masters of open world titles, Ubisoft is easily the most familiar with the genre, and it's clear while the world is large, Fenyx's ability to glide around the map keeps things in perspective. While not giving players the ability to outright fly, gliding does make the world feel smaller, but in this case, that's not a bad thing. You'll need its ability to scout out each of the various regions, and at the start, everything is covered in some sort of fog of war, but once you climb the area's statue, depicting the god it's designed after, you'll be able to see the layout of that specific land. One thing you'll notice is that each region of the map has a distinct theme, and that really plays to the overall design of an area. The first zone, or tutorial zone, the Clashing Rocks, is inspired by Hermes, and that's where our adventure begins. As we'll discuss later, this is where the story of Immortals Fenyx Rising really steps off. In the struggle between the gods and the Titan Typhon, the Clashing Rocks was the last stand, and you'll notice the remains of an epic battle as you learn the basics of the game. Shipwrecks scattered along the coast, crumbling ruins, and shattered statues all point towards a conflict, and it's here where we get our first taste of the Golden Isles. Things take a drastic turn as we begin exploring the other locations on the isle. As I mentioned, each region is inspired by a different god or goddess, and we see that almost immediately upon entering a new zone. The Valley of Eternal Springs, inspired by Aphrodite, is lush and vibrant, with rolling hills, grand mesas, and filled with plants and animals. Water and life are central themes for this region, and almost everything is reflected with those ideas in mind. As you would imagine, Ares, the god of war, is the inspiration behind the War Den region of the Golden Isles, and let's just say this isn't the most inviting place. The entire region is one gigantic battlefield with a constant heavy fog and scorched earth to remind you of the horrors of war. This region also features defeated titans that have been frozen in time. It's a foreboding place, and to cap it all off is Ares' fortress, which is just as massive and terrifying as you'd imagine. The next region, the Grove of Kleos, is inspired by the goddess of wisdom herself, Athena. To differentiate this region with Aphrodite, the Ubisoft team really taps into the spirit of Greek architecture. Palaces, temples, columns, they're used liberally to remind us that this is a Greek-inspired game. There's also a lot of verticality in this region that makes it stand out from the others. It's the closest we'll see to an Assassin's Creed Odyssey-style environment, but still manages to find its own identity within the game. Now, this next region is easily my favorite, and it pays homage to Hephaestus, the god of fire and forging. Imagine a Greek-themed steampunk world, and that's kind of what we're working with here. The colors are all very warm, yellows, oranges, and reds, and overall, things look just a bit more mechanical, and that makes sense since the main enemies you'll be fighting here are these massive metal constructs. The Forge Lands feeds the massive forge that make up big parts of the region. Trees have been stripped, and everywhere you look, resources have been collected to power these massive machines. It's an amazing area of the Golden Isles, and like I said, easily my favorite. Of course, we couldn't also forget about our favorite Greek god Zeus, who has his own region in the game, King's Peak. And we don't know much about this region. Ubisoft always keeps a few things under wraps before launch, but we do know that this area of the map is largely covered in snow and is more of a mountainous area of the Golden Isles. We know Zeus and Prometheus, the two narrators driving the game forward, are talking on a mountain, so it makes sense that this would be part of the King's Peak. What's interesting to me is that this region is much darker than I would have anticipated. As the king of the Olympian gods, I would have expected something more resplendent and kingly, but from everything we've seen, this region is much more foreboding. This is by far the region I'm most excited to explore, and can't wait to see how they make King's Peak stand out from the rest of the regions. Finally, smack dab in the middle of the Golden Isles, we have the Gates of Tartarus. All roads lead to this smaller area of the map where the Titan Typhon resides. As we've seen from various trailers and screenshots, this is the most corrupt region of the Golden Isles and features a massive volcano as the centerpiece. In Greek mythology, the Gates of Tartarus represent the doorway from the overworld to the underworld, and it's a fitting location for some of the more climactic battles. No matter where you are on the Golden Isles, you'll almost always be able to see this location. No doubt this is where the conclusion of our story will take place, with us fighting Typhon, but that is a discussion for later. Throughout the various gameplay demos and content creator previews, we've also seen snippets of other regions not exclusively part of the Golden Isles, specifically in the form of vaults. These vaults transform Fenyx into another dimension and blur the line, combining Greek ideas with a futuristic twist. This is just one example of a way the Ubisoft team is expanding the world beyond the Golden Isles, and it's good to know because it means they're willing to get a little creative to expand the universe. With a new IP, you never know where things are going to go. For instance, at this point we know that an Assassin's Creed game is going to get multiple DLCs that will expand the existing world of that particular game. But for something like Fenyx Rising, it's harder to tell. At this point, there's not much we can do but wait and wonder what else there'll be to explore. Immortals Fenyx Rising takes a completely different approach to storytelling as compared to other Ubisoft titles. While games like Assassin's Creed Valhalla take a much more realistic and complex approach to a narrative, Fenyx Rising is much more straightforward. The game embraces the comedic adventures of the late 90s and early 2000s. If you remember games like Banjo-Kazooie that didn't take itself all too seriously, that's exactly the type of spirit Ubisoft is going for with this game. The story is told by Prometheus and Zeus, who narrate the entire adventure. Prometheus is your more straightforward, factual guide, while Zeus injects humor as often as possible. Fenyx, unlike other heroic characters, isn't afraid to break the fourth wall and interact with the narrators, reacting to their commentary, and oftentimes those lines are crossed and you can really feel the story extending well beyond what we're used to for a typical adventure RPG. Of course, with any grand adventure also comes a larger-than-life ultimate evil, and in the case of Immortals Fenyx Rising, that's Typhon, a titan out for revenge against the gods for banishing him in Tartarus. I mentioned Zeus and Prometheus before, who are both grappling with the reality of the situation on the Golden Isles. The other gods are missing. Zeus can no longer harness the power of lightning, and Prometheus is putting all his faith in mortals, more specifically, Fenyx. Our main character is really no one special. A shield bearer, Fenyx was never destined for greatness, but like most good stories, destiny had other plans. Your ship crashes on the shores of the Golden Isle, and this is where your relationship with the gods really steps off. You'll soon realize that your fellow soldiers, including your brother, a legendary warrior, has been turned to stone, and it's up to you to figure out how to break this curse. You're almost immediately introduced to Hermes, one of the few remaining gods that hasn't been cursed, but it's clear that Typhon is looking to change that. Luckily, your intervention saves the god from a horrible fate, and he'll quickly become yet another guide on your adventure, but one that sticks by your side throughout your journey. As you start to unravel what's going on around the Golden Isles, it becomes increasingly clear that you need to travel to each region and remove Typhon's influence. The Olympian gods have been cursed, banished, and tricked, and as the hero of the story, it's your job to figure out how to undo whatever evil magic is binding them. We've already seen examples of how this plays out in real time. Each island has a story arc that revolves around a specific god or goddess. In the Valley of Eternal Springs, you'll have to free Aphrodite, who's been cursed into a tree. Each island is its own entity, but provides context to the overall story. As you free the gods and goddesses, they'll provide crucial stepping-off points in the forms of upgrades and access that will help in our ultimate fight against Typhon. The truth about Immortals Fenyx Rising is that the story isn't incredibly deep or complex. It's a linear narrative that takes us from one point to another, but don't let that fool you. There is still plenty of optional content for players to enjoy. One of the biggest deviations in terms of story elements is the lack of NPCs to offer things like side quests. Because the Golden Isles isn't chock full of people, those opportunities come in other forms, like puzzles. I think it's important to remember that Immortals Fenyx Rising is the third major open-world RPG from Ubisoft in 2020, and as expected, they're all going to be a bit different. If you're looking for some lighthearted humor, a story that doesn't take itself too seriously, and a more Zelda-esque narrative, well then, I think Immortals Fenyx Rising is the perfect game for you. If you've played any Ubisoft games in the last 5 years, you're probably familiar with the way they handle combat in their games, but Immortals Fenyx Rising attempts to step out from behind the shadows of more established titles and carve a new path, one more accessible to players of any age. When you break it all down, that's really at the heart of combat in this game. The tools you have are simple: a sword, an axe, and a bow, and a host of godly powers, but we'll get there, I promise. Now, because Fenyx Rising plays more like an action game, think Darksiders, not Dark Souls. You'll even see that infamous combo meter on the side of your screen made famous by action games throughout the decades. Each weapon has its specific purpose, and it's important to understand that purpose so you can string maneuvers together. Your sword acts as a light attack, your builder, if you will, which deals a small amount of damage to enemies but has the added value of restoring stamina after stringing combinations of moves together. Every action game has this type of attack, the one that connects all of your major abilities. Fenyx also has access to an axe attack, which acts, in this case, as a heavy attack. Heavy attacks hit harder and have the added effect of increasing the stun gauge of an enemy. Every enemy from the lowliest of minions to the beefiest of bosses has a secondary health bar. When that bar fills up, the enemy becomes stunned, rendering them motionless and increasing the damage they take for a period of time. Stunning enemies is a fundamental pillar of combat in Immortals Fenyx Rising. There's no better way to take down an enemy than by stunning them. Of course, axe attacks are only one piece of that puzzle, and here is where we get to the good stuff. Fenyx also has access to a variety of special god powers that not only deal a large amount of damage, but also inflict stun damage to enemies. These are the ultimate abilities in the game, and while there may not be many of them, they are certainly effective. You'll gain access to Heracles' Strength, which allows you to pick up and move heavy objects. You use this primarily to solve puzzles, but it's worth pointing out that hurling objects at your enemies is a damn good strategy. In fact, it's clear just by how much rubble is on the ground that the developers wanted this to be a focus in combat. Other abilities include things like Apollo's Arrow, which gives you direct control over the flight path of an arrow. This again will be primarily used to solve puzzles, but can also be used effectively against enemies and bosses. The remaining abilities all tie nicely into the flow of combat. Hephaestus' Hammer, Athena's Dash, Ares' Wrath, and Phosphorus' Attack all weave seamlessly into the fast-paced combat the game is designed for. We also can't forget about our wings, which gives Fenyx the ability to float and suspend in air while attacking enemies, locking them in place with a barrage of attacks. It's hard not to see the parallels between Immortals Fenyx Rising and The Legend of Zelda, but no one ever said Nintendo had exclusive rights to the genre, and it's exciting to see a new game step into that territory. Now, there is something we haven't talked about yet, and that is stamina, which is monumentally important to combat in this game. Call it overly simple, but stamina dictates pretty much every action, from climbing mountains to using your god powers. When you run out of stamina, you're dead in the water, with no great way to avoid taking damage. Dodging, the primary way to avoid an attack, does require stamina, but you can also parry enemy attacks, which negates damage and applies some stun damage to those enemies. This is all stuff you should be relatively familiar with if you've played any of Ubisoft's open-world games, but there are subtle changes sprinkled throughout that, in my opinion, make the game a lot easier to just pick up and play. As the keepers to the entire Assassin's Creed series, you'd also imagine there to be a big stealth component to Immortals Fenyx Rising, and you're right, there is a system, although it's not that complicated. Crouching allows you to avoid enemy detection. I know, revolutionary, but instead of being able to outright kill enemies, you can attack them with a special stealth attack. Don't get me wrong, when you can do this, you should, 100%, as it will knock off a considerable amount of your enemy's health, but it's far from the assassinations Ubisoft is known for. It's clear that Immortals Fenyx Rising doesn't have the most in-depth combat system out there. What you see is what you get, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. One thing to keep in mind with this game is that combat is really only 50% of the challenge. Immortals Fenyx Rising taps into puzzle elements liberally, and your ability to run, jump, and even attack all come into the picture when presented those challenges. In my opinion, it's not always necessary to have an intricate combat system if it's only one aspect of the game. Of course, there are matters of repetitiveness we have to consider, but as you'll see later on, there is still plenty of progression to keep things evolving. Combat feels more arcadey, and that's by design. It keeps things fluid, fast-paced, and ensures that players of any age can grasp the concept, and I think that's something we should remember. With games like Watch Dogs Legion and Assassin's Creed Valhalla already out, there's no real reason to have more of the same, so shifting gears and giving players a different combat experience makes the most sense. I will say one thing about Ubisoft: they've always been good at making boss fights, and that's something I'll be paying close attention to. Variety, complexity, moveset, these are all the things that matter, and as the ultimate combat challenge in action games, they're more important than ever in Immortals Fenyx Rising. Whether or not combat still feels good after 20 hours of playing the game, well, that's still to be determined, but with the knowledge of how it works under our belts, we can venture forth and take on Typhon in the Golden Isles. No matter what the RPG, nothing is more important than progression, the systems that drive your adventures forward, and today, we're going to explore how that all works in Immortals Fenyx Rising. Unlike most RPGs, Fenyx Rising doesn't have a traditional leveling system. In fact, character levels don't even exist. This is usually the barometer that developers use to balance content. So what does that mean for players looking to progress on the Golden Isles? We've already talked about the weapons in the game at the most basic level, but what we didn't talk about was the underlying system that keeps the entire game in line, the Forge of Hephaestus. The Forge acts as a central hub to upgrade your gear, and this is crucial because these upgrades improve your damage or defense across the board. Specific weapons don't have individual stats. In fact, the only two things that item provides players is a special effect and a certain look. Weapons and armor are broken down into types, and you improve them as a whole. This means when you collect enough resources and upgrade your axes, every axe you own gets a buff. The kicker to that is the way the upgrade system also impacts the special effects on the various items in the game. When upgrading an item, you'll also buff the effects of the various items that fall into that category. This puts an emphasis on the special effects and should hopefully allow you to make a gear selection that's in line with your playstyle. It may sound complicated on paper, but it's actually one of the most streamlined systems I've ever seen an action RPG ever implement. Upgrading items isn't just a stat boost either. At a certain point, you'll unlock a second tier of special effects on an item that will further incentivize you to think about what pieces of gear and what weapons you choose to yield. Weapons and armor are only one aspect of character progression in Immortals Fenyx Rising, and in fact, there are a number of other systems that directly impact your capabilities. A skill upgrade system is the closest thing you'll find to a traditional talent tree in the game, but here again we see a much simpler system unfold. A major category opens up some sort of new potential for a skill, while the branching minor nodes enhance something passively. This system improves everything from your basic sword attacks to swimming and provides a snapshot on one screen of your potential as a player. God powers also have their own unique upgrade system that looks and functions exactly like the skill upgrade system, albeit a bit more robust. You'll notice multiple improvements to a single power, and this allows for more long-term viability throughout your adventures. Now you may be asking yourself, how do I upgrade my skills and abilities without levels or talent points? And the answer is simple: treasure. Immortals Fenyx Rising may not have a player-level resource, but the game is chock full of other resources that you'll find across the Golden Isles. You'll need each and every resource you can get your hands on if you hope to max out your potential. Aside from the weapons, skills, and god powers, we can't forget about the potions, which also play a pivotal part in our Immortals experience. Potions to restore health and stamina are all fine and good, but it's the potions that increase your attack and defense for 90 seconds that really matter when your back's against the wall. Here again, another progression system unfolds, and this one should look familiar as it's virtually identical to the other systems we've talked about. The potion upgrade system enhances the effects of the various potions, and as we can see, just as robust as the God Power tree. Another feature, God Blessings, act as a sort of progression system, albeit one you can't directly control or manipulate. As you do the main story, the various Greek gods will bestow their blessings on you, giving you a passive buff that will undoubtedly help you progress further in the game. Each god has 3 different blessings which you'll unlock as you help them with their troubles. At the end of the day, progression in Immortals Fenyx Rising comes down to do the main story, collect resources, navigate a rather narrow upgrade tree, and move on to the next challenge. Again, and I've mentioned this before, simplicity isn't a bad thing, and although the grindiness of it all is perfectly clear, it's straightforward, and I think a lot of players are going to appreciate that. For a more resourced focused game, you have to be wondering, how am I going to collect all of these things needed to upgrade my character? And for that, we turn to the Hermes Heroic Tasks board. Because the Golden Isles is devoid of the standard NPC idea we see in other open-world RPGs, the Ubisoft team had to implement another system to help players progress, and that's where the Tasks board comes into focus. This board features two categories: Heroic Tasks, which are more complicated challenges, and Live Tasks, which act as daily and weekly challenges, and all reward some form of loot. Of course, you'll still find plenty of resources out in the world exploring and doing the main quests, but this board is the stopgap that helps you bridge any resource problems you may run into. Not only does the board provide you with resources, but some tasks even reward gear, which makes doing them that much more important. The Hermes Heroic Task board answers a big question I think a lot of fans had prior to launch that will keep players engaged. I should also mention that Ubisoft has added a transmog system to the game, which will allow players to customize the look of Fenyx while still keeping items equipped that will benefit them in combat. Your adventures on the Golden Isles are about to take off, and with complex puzzles and challenging boss encounters right around the corner, one can only imagine the grand adventures that are just ahead. Thank you all so much for checking out our ultimate preview for Immortals Fenyx Rising. If you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting that thumbs up and subscribing to the channel. We're on the hunt for 100,000 subscribers, and with your help, we'll be one step closer. My name is Kodiak, and from everyone here at Legacy Gaming, thanks for watching, and play on.